Okay, so just coming up next, I'll just invite the four panellists up if they can. We've got Sophie Scott is who will be moderating the panel. Sophie is the National Medical Reporter for the ABC, in addition to being a prominent public speaker. Sophie has won numerous awards for excellence in medical and health journalism, including Australian Museum Eureka Award and multiple awards from various professional medical colleges. Sophie reports regularly on the ABC News. Lateline 7:30, she hosts the Health Quarter on ABC News 24 and is a frequent guest on Richard Glover's 702 Drive.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And we've got Renee. I don't know if you have a name tag on a spot, but if you want to just come and take a seat as well. We've got a big group here. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Today we're going to talk about surrogacy in Australia and what should surrogacy look like in Australia. And we'll look at what's wrong with the current practice and talk a little bit about what it's like to go through the process of being a surrogate and having a surrogate. So joining us to talk about this is we have Kate Bourne, who's the head of the Australian and New Zealand Infertility Counsellors Association, Chelsea Tobin, who became a parent through domestic altruistic surrogacy, Jenny Milbank, an academic and lawyer from UTS, who's written and researched this issue, Dr. Peter Illingworth, an IVF specialist at IVF Australia who does a great number of Australian surrogacy cases, and also Renee Golland, who acted as a surrogate in 2014. So welcome our panel, everybody, and thank you very much. What was that?
I thought you got a PowerPoint. Were you able to put our PowerPoints up as we're talking?
Oh, possibly. We have a. If you need to refer to the PowerPoint, just let me know. I was going to start first with Chelsea. Can you just tell us a little bit about your experience and also what do you think were the key issues for you with surrogacy in Australia?
My name is Chelsea. I am a really lucky and happy mum of a 2-year-old. As a relatively unimportant side note in parenting, our daughter Matilda was born through donor egg, donor sperm and altruistic surrogacy. So I'm a happy, lucky mum, and my husband and I are probably also the most barren people in the world. But it really has nothing to do with being a mum. I mean, the story's not terrific. It's probably a third of my life. We had 80-something eggs. We had 40-something embryo transfers. We had 28 miscarriages. Still, I think I'm good, and then 2 years later, your heart races. I think I'm really lucky. There wasn't a process or a system for. We're Victorian, so we are under the Victorian law. There wasn't really a system or process for donor egg, donor sperm in a surrogate. There is now, which is terrific. I hope there's not too many Michael and Chelseas in the world. You asked me what the issues were.
Yeah, what were the key problems or the key concerns that you had which would need to be rectified to make the system of surrogacy better in Australia?
Look, I have experience of one, so my views are draft and I'm really happy for them to be tested. I'd love them to be challenged. I'd like to give back to the conversation, but this is an experience of one. I think my number one point was I found there was conflicts of interest throughout the process. So I understand we were taking on something. I understand surrogacy is a bit new. I understand we were pioneering in terms of our scenario. But like anything that's new, it needs to evolve. And so my feedback is in the spirit of constructive evolution. But I did feel there was conflicts of interest. I thought so after surrogacy is no longer a medical issue, i.e. Chelsea, you will never have a child, and i.e. my aunt, who was our surrogate, you are able to have the child, and the doctor signs that off, it becomes quite a social issue, and counselling plays a really important part in that. But I found that the counselling that you were supposed to be the most vulnerable to and give all your fears to is also the person that writes the recommendation to the court. And I found that incredibly unhelpful. And I should say, at the end of our journey, my husband and I flew around Australia trying to find a doctor that would support our quest. And I found all the clinics the same, so I'm not trying to isolate any particular clinic or anything like that. But I do think we ended up getting useful counselling, which is really important outside of the process. So I think there could be some good debate. I think Karen, mentioned that having different parties involved, not all the one clinic in-house, is useful. I'd also say that we should have a Commonwealth law, not state by state. It's confusing, it's hard, it's ineffective. I absolutely think it should be legalised. There's problems with compensated surrogacy, but I think there's way more problems with altruistic surrogacy. We need to take a pragmatic approach. There's not enough surrogates. And altruistic surrogacy, I think, for me, you become so desperate that it starts to cloud your decision making. And I think that's not when great decisions get made, and this is a really important decision. So I'd like to see more support and a better framework in Australia.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you a little bit later. We might just ask Renee, can you just tell us a bit about your experience and what were the pitfalls, or if anything, and what you think could be improved to make it a better situation for women like you?
Sure. I am a surrogate from Victoria. Gave birth to a baby boy last November for my intended parents. It's a long journey in Victoria, one of the hardest states in terms of hoops you have to jump through to try and go through the process. For us, it was a wonderful outcome. They've got a healthy baby boy now who's almost 6 months old, and for me it was a very good experience, a very positive experience, and one that I look back on that as something that myself and my family can be really proud on. But I also think moving forward there are some things that are very grey that need to be smoothed out a little bit, but there's also some things that are really black and white, in my personal opinion, that we can do better. Medicare rebates, obviously, across the board. Continuity of laws. We all need to come under one banner. We can't just have this, Queensland, you can possibly undergo a transfer 4 weeks after meeting intended parents. In Victoria, your process is pushed out to almost a year. Counselling needs to be mandatory pre-surrogacy arrangements during pregnancy for both intended parents and the surrogate, and post-pregnancy as well. And there are some real holes in the states with those to make sure that all parties are protected. Parents on birth certificates. I am still the legal parent of the child I birthed, and that does not sit right with me. As much as I love him for who he is and how he came to be, he's not my baby. He's not my child. He's the child of the parents who made him. I just baked him for a few months. So, that really needs to change. And there was no inclination whatsoever in my mind that I was ever going to keep this little boy. Because if I wanted a baby, and as brutal as it sounds, I would have sex with my husband and I would have one. I would not go through 12 months of counselling and legals and IVF transfers and drugs and everything like that to say at the end of it, I think I might keep this little guy because he's never mine. Surrogate and IP matching, I think it's crucial. I think that a surrogate and an intended parent needs to go through a psychological counselling process before they are matched up with a surrogate. Because at the moment we're having situations where surrogates and IPs are coming together, they're going down the process, they're going down the track, it's costing them a lot of time and money, and then there is a barrier that is uncovered. So at least if they can go through that first and everything is laid bare on the table and everybody's on the same page. Keeping costs down, and I know it's going to be hard. America has a really great practice, but as surrogates we are all aware of how much this is costing our intended parents, and I'm not sure that a $30,000 payment would sit right with me to carry for someone else when I already know that my intended parents may have spent tens, 20s, even hundreds of thousands of dollars before they even got to the state of wanting a surrogate. I'd also like there to be a normality about it. There are inevitable, unfortunate comparisons between surrogacy and adoption. They are two completely different things, and I think that everybody needs to be on the same page about what surrogacy involves and what adoption involves. Surrogacy is a group of people coming together who want to achieve a goal, and that is to make a baby. Adoption however many circumstances, can be, misconstrued as a mother giving up a child or something along those lines. Now, I have absolutely there's nothing wrong with adoption. Those laws need to change in this country as well. But the comparison of a woman giving up a child in terms of surrogacy is completely untrue, unrelated. And I think that can sometimes cloud the waters. I'm getting there. I think that there needs to be more involvement with surrogates partners. And I've said, and I will say again, that a journey of surrogacy is not just about the woman, it is about her partner, and they are such an important role. Surrogates have children, their partners pick up the slack. When I had my head in the toilet, I had morning sickness, it was my husband who was looking after the kids. It was him who was making sure that I was okay. It takes a big man or a big woman to respect and support their wife or partner through carrying a child for someone else. And I think that they really need to be recognised in the process.
Because you were telling me last night you had 2 or 3 children under 4?
When I gave birth to my little passenger, my twins had just turned 2 and our oldest daughter was 3.5.
Wow.
So
you told me that last night, I was thinking, oh my God.
I must admit, my intended parents were brilliant. They are in the same state, they're 40 minutes away. They dropped everything when I needed them. But when it was the middle of the night and I was tired and I was emotional and I needed someone to rely on, my husband was there for me. And I'm getting emotional talking about him. He's a good man, and we would go out and people would look at us and they would say, oh, you're going to be busy. And I'd say to them, it's not my baby. Oh, we got some looks about that. So we went through a lot. Surrogacy is confronting. And so him coming to counselling, him getting psychological evaluations is a good thing. And that's something that needs to continue in all states. But finally, I think that if we were going down the path of compensated surrogacy in Australia, we really need to make sure that there is no sense of ownership over a surrogate. That just because money is paid, just because a woman is caring for someone else and a contract has been signed, that an intended parent does not have the right to say, you must eat this or you must do that. That there is no ownership, that woman cannot be owned in the process.
Okay, look, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing. I noticed, Jenny, you were nodding quite a lot during that. So can you give us your thoughts, just with your experience and your understanding of the legal system as well?
Sure. Look, to start with, I had a PowerPoint which isn't up, so I'm just going to tell you what it says in the true history of PowerPoint presentations, where people tell you what the PowerPoint said. It's a big placard that someone's holding up. It's written in Texter. They're holding it up at a protest, and it says, what do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review. Academics see that and think, at last someone has finally voiced what we want, and normal people think it's just funny. And the reason that I had that placard as my PowerPoint today is that we're actually conducting a research project on cross-border reproduction, particularly looking at surrogacy and egg donation. The evidence-based change that I want begins with all of you, because you are the evidence, and as people who are the evidence, you need to help make that change. So I want to see the legal system change to be more responsive to the needs of people who are undertaking this process. And if Michaela and Anita could raise their hands if you're here, we're here to talk to everyone, to seek expressions of interest for people who want to be interviewed for our project. We've done a lot of work over the years on the laws around surrogacy in Australia and internationally, and we think that after 26 public inquiries over 30 years and 17 laws about surrogacy, we still don't have it right. We don't think it's working. People are saying it's not working, and we need to actually start from the beginning, which is, what are people doing? What do they need? What went wrong and what went right? And to work out a process of change from that. What we don't need is knee-jerk reactions to sensational stories in the press about absolutely exceptional cases that are tragic, that involve abuse, that involve twins being separated and so on. It's like if you were going to base the family law system on soap operas. They're absolutely the least representative cases are the ones that are getting all the attention. And I know, and I'm hearing from people that they're actually really reluctant to engage in the press, that they're really reluctant to talk about it because they feel like their stories have been told out of context, and that we are in a kind of climate of moral panic and crisis around surrogacy law. And we need to actually just take a step back, look at our evidence base, and I'm back to my placard, and think carefully about what has worked elsewhere, what has worked in America, what hasn't. And I think there are some things that haven't, actually, and we'll be talking about multiple births in the next session, and the high rate of neonatal complications as a result of that, and craft a system from there. So I think we've got, we can look elsewhere and see what's, take some things that have worked from elsewhere and change some things that haven't, but we actually need to start talking about what people are doing now and work from there.
And how important do you think it will be to have that research so that then people can go to governments and go to say, here's what's happening, here is what we need to do to make things better, because they'll need that evidence to be able to make an informed decision about legislation.
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely vital. And as I said, I think from the last 30 years, what we've had are a few exceptional cases in the press and a lot of parliamentarians basing their judgments on instinct, on anecdote, on their sister-in-law's first cousin's friend who told them a story about whatever. We actually need to systematically gather together the Australian and the comparative evidence and craft something from there.
Okay, thank you so much. Kate, can we hear from you and your experience about what you think, sticking with the theme of what's going on in Australia at the moment, and if we were crafting the perfect system for surrogacy in Australia, what it should look like?
Well, I actually think the Australian system is pretty good in many ways, and I don't think we should let go of that. I think the primary focus in Australia is on the child's needs. I think there's a respect for the well-being of all parties, and I think we do follow a process similar to what Kim and Karen described today of fully informed preparation, consent, support and transparency, and incorporating psychological, legal and medical practice. So I think that's what's working. I think what needs to change is that we don't have a culture of surrogacy yet. It has been only fairly recently that that legislation has been passed in pretty much all states, making it legal. But what we do have is inconsistency across those states legally. And we have a lack of consistency then too in things like what are acceptable compensation for surrogates, and I think that then can create a fairly difficult situation between, particularly as often the intended parents are responsible for giving the surrogate the actual payment for things, and I think that creates an uneasy tension when you have that occurring. I think we see some states where they discriminate against single and same-sex couples, and I think that needs to change. Again, I would reiterate about the Medicare funding. I think it's because we have that lack of culture. I think it does mean that some families think that it'll be some intended parents think it'll be impossible to find a surrogate, and I actually think that's wrong. But it's because we don't sort of see it around us, and I think that will improve as time goes on, and particularly I think if there can be more agencies who act as you said, Renee, about helping people to find surrogates. VARTA has produced a Finding a Surrogate brochure, which is in your satchel, hopefully to help that process to discuss important issues between the intended parents and the surrogate. I also think I would again agree with Renee about the importance of counselling. I think there is a big emphasis on assessment, and look, I guess I disagree with you, I think that's really important, and I think Kim and Karen would agree. It is really important that you have really thorough assessment, but I would agree you need a counsellor for support, and that they need to be different. and that the surrogate and the intended parents have that support right the way through, before, during and after. So I think that's essential. I think there needs to be good education about all of this. And also, I would agree with Jenny, I'd like to see more research on the outcomes. What is it? What are the ingredients of good outcomes, and what happens when things go wrong?
So, Peter, could we ask you to give us your experience, given that you're working in IVF and involved with a lot of surrogacy cases? Who's coming to you wanting surrogacy, and just a little bit. So almost what we talked about in the morning tea break was really, really interesting, just finding out what's going on in Australia.
Yep. I think there's two key messages. I think the first is that this is a situation that is evolving. 10 years ago, a meeting such as we're having today would have been just impossible. And I would ask everyone to hold patience as ideas move forward and as Australian society catches up. There are two big changes that are gradually, steadily happening. One is the acceptance of same-sex couples as parents. The growth of rainbow parenting into an everyday part of Australian life has been one of the greatest developments I have seen in the last decade or so, and that's a huge change. Even 10 years ago, the idea of same-sex couples as parents still was a difficult concept for many, many people, and that's gradually gaining acceptance, and that's a really, really good thing. The second thing that's changing is people's fear of surrogacy. 10 years ago, everybody was absolutely scared of surrogacy because of the risks and the perception of risks, which I think we're gradually understanding was a lot higher than the reality of risk. And the three ethical prerogatives that apply to someone like myself who runs a service where we support couples who come through to use surrogacy is firstly to allow people to have a family and support people in them having their families. The second is to create secure relationships between the surrogates and the IPs, and security of relationship is one of the most important concerns for everybody. It's important for the trust between the parties is the most critical thing in making it all work. And I think this is an area where we're gradually evolving and learning. Up until now, our group particularly has only worked on pre-existing relationships, where there are friends or families or strong pre-existing relationships. But it's clear as we learn from the experiences we see round about us that may not be the only way forward, and there may be other approaches. The third issue is the one of exploitation. And exploitation cannot go away as a potential issue. And I think there's a huge difference between compensation and exploiting a poor person, because surrogacy is not a completely safe procedure. Exploiting a poor person to help a wealthy person have their family. And I think all of that has to be borne in mind. I'd also like the fact that I like working in New South Wales, because New South Wales has, I think, some of the best laws in Australia. It's not as bureaucratic as the Victoria, pardon me, and we are allowed to compensate. Under New South Wales law, a surrogate can be compensated up to 4 months of her potential salary as well as other expenses. So that could be, for somebody who has an earning potential of $60,000 a year, it is legal for IPs to reimburse her up to about $20,000 to $30,000 or so without breaking the law. So the law is reasonable. And look, we all find interstate laws frustrating. The fact is that under the Australian Constitution, a federal law for this is impossible without a rewriting of the entire Constitution. And we came up against that during the donor sperm debate, when the party got together in Canberra to have a common federal law, and the Commonwealth Attorney General stopped the whole debate within about 5 seconds by saying this would rewrite the entire Australian Constitution. It won't happen. So it would be better if each state moved to consistency between laws. But I don't want to go to consistency where New South Wales has to become like Western Australia, for example. If the outcome was Western Australia becoming like New South Wales, I'd be very, very happy. And so would Western Australia be very, very happy. But we have to be careful it doesn't go in the wrong direction.
But when you were just talking about states becoming consistent, that's happening, for example, on the issue of domestic violence and family violence, that they're looking at different states have different rules and picking, what is the best practice and ideally implementing that across nationally. So I guess there could be a precedent there looking at family violence and domestic violence laws.
Yeah, look, I'm pretty optimistic about all this. I think that everybody in this room is learning. And I think society is learning as we go. And I think this is all slowly but surely moving in the right direction for everybody.
I just wanted to touch on that point you mentioned about compensation and exploitation. What safeguards would you need to build into the system, is that if we had compensation for surrogates, that there was no exploitation happening? What anyone on the panel who'd like to answer that?
It's a complicated debate. Yeah. Some people are worried about amounts being too high, other people are worried about amounts being too low. Any sum of money is relative. It's relative to the local economy, it's relative to the cost of the treatment, it's relative to the living standards of the parties who are involved. So setting maximums and minimums is only the beginning of a discussion about whether or not that amount of money is an improper inducement, because that's the real question. Is the woman who is choosing to engage in this pregnancy doing so out of an authentic belief that this is the right choice for her and the right outcome for a child born, or is her will overborne by other considerations, whether they're family pressures or whether they're monetary pressures? The important thing is that the process is there to ensure that she's not making the wrong decision for her, that she's making an authentic decision.
And I guess the other issue would be if there was compensation in Australia and it was a very expensive process for intended parents to go through, could that then push people offshore again, and that wouldn't necessarily solve the problems that we have in Australia? They would be forced to go offshore again.
Yeah, look, I think making the process affordable at home, there's two things. One is making the process affordable at home, and a number of people have mentioned Medicare and the costs of the regulation here, but there's also a perception of cost. So there is a perception that certain overseas pathways are relatively affordable, but that's based on the idea that it's going to work and it's going to work the first time. And actually a lot of people go into offshore processes having looked at the website and downloaded the brochure and gone, oh, I can do it. I can get that second mortgage and I can borrow the money off my mum and I can afford that amount. It's not that amount. It's not that amount. And I think one of the important things that Kim said in her presentation was it's not a 9-month process. It's 2 years if you're lucky. It's 10 years if you're not. It's a long, long haul.
And in Australia, do you think, and I might ask Kate and Renee, do you think we have adequate psychological screening of people who become surrogates in Australia?
Yes, I do. I think there is a very thorough process, but I think the difference is that it was interesting to hear Karen talk about, the agency finding potential people. Here, people find each other. So what can happen when people front up for assessment is that they may not really disclose fully about mental health issues, or they're really trying to put on their best face, and that's really counterproductive. It's really, what we're trying to do here is make sure that this isn't a one-night stand. We want this to work, and people need to see, it's been really heartening to see everyone emphasise the importance of good counselling. And we're not really, people come and they think we're the bad guys, but we're not. We want this to work. We want this to work for you. So we want to identify any potential pitfalls before. We don't want those breakdowns happening during the pregnancy or afterwards. So it should be a really, really useful process, because if someone doesn't really want to do this, we don't want them continuing out of obligation or guilt. We want those things to be highlighted so that people can go away, think about it and decide what's best for them. So, yeah.
Renee, what were your thoughts?
I think that at the moment in Australia, by the time the parties go down the path of counselling, there's already been considerable time and money invested, and to then go down that path and find that one or more parties is not suitable, gets up the hope of the surrogates, gets up the hopes of the IPs. I think doing all of that beforehand, where a surrogate can really be counselled in what is exactly involved in the process and the risks and everything like that, to make sure that you're on the same page before you go down the path with an intended parent, and also from the intended parent's perspective as well, can only be a good thing moving forward.
And Chelsea?
Yeah, I'll just add, one of the best things I think about the current system is the principle that an embryo is not put in anyone until all the scenarios are really thought out. So just a few examples. So my aunt and I get to 20 weeks and the baby's got a mass deformity, or 12 weeks. What happens? What happens if she feels really upset when we give birth? What is the birth separation going to look like? How is she going to cope? There's so many things that need to be thought through, and that the counselling is, reproduction is meant to be two people. When you do third-party reproduction, it's complicated. I thought it was big. We went through a 10-year process of eliminating my husband's sperm, then my eggs, then my womb. I thought it was big, having gone through that journey. It is even bigger than I thought. It is the best thing I've ever done. My aunt would say it's the best thing she ever did. We would both say there was no surprises, because the process you go through, albeit I would say it's a bit overburdensome and a bit too governed, I think the counselling is so important, so that that embryo doesn't go in until, Renee and people like me have terrific experiences, because all those what-ifs are sort of grounded to the floor.
And Peter, would that be your view as well? Or do you think that it's adequate at the moment, the level of psychological screening and counselling that people go through?
I think it is. I mean, the big question we say to everyone when they start is, we want everyone to look back on this and say, yep, I'm really glad I took part in that. We don't want anyone to get halfway down this road and think, why the heck am I involved in this? And that's why the counselling at the beginning is the very, very important. And I think I picked up something from Chelsea that I hadn't actually thought of fully before, and that is the conflict of interest between a counsellor who has two jobs. One is to listen empathetically and provide the participant in the arrangement with the right advice, but also to provide a legal report that is necessary to make it go through. And I think that's a critical point we need to pay more attention to.
Kate, did you have a quick comment?
I've got to say something. And I really liked your point, Peter. And not only that the intended parents and surrogates, but at the 21st party, everybody is there, and that the 21-year-old goes, fantastic. This was really well thought through, and you thought of everything, and I'm proud of all of you. The one thing I think that's really missing is that we just emphasise too much on screening people, and then sometimes the support isn't there after that, and that's when reality hits and people don't necessarily feel the way they thought they'd feel, and the intended parents often feel, it's very difficult to allow someone else to carry your baby for you. And if you've had many, I hate to think of how many transfers you had, Chelsea, but if you've had that sort of experience, it's very hard to trust that this baby is, going to survive, and you're going to get a baby in your arms at the end of it. And it can be hard to trust that the surrogate will actually be able to give the baby back. And for the surrogate, she may feel a little bit differently once she's, really nauseous, or, really feeling sick and tired and cranky. So, and that's also quite a difficult relationship to manage, for the intended parents to support the surrogate, as she might want to be supported. I mean, she mightn't even know. Any men who've tried to support their pregnant partner, sometimes no matter what you say, it's wrong. So for the intended parents to do that, it's really tough. And so I think they each need a counsellor to say that to. And if there are communications breakdown, that the counsellor can pick that up and get them all in the room and get it back on track. Again, after the birth, when the surrogate's feeling like she's got empty arms and she's full of hormones, and she's crying everywhere, the intended parents are so busy raising that newborn, they're possibly it's difficult for them to be supporting her, because they're also coping with a new baby. And any parent who's had a new baby, you feel like you don't know what you're doing, and you feel like someone is going to take that away once someone, I know that my husband and I thought that someone was going to work out that we didn't actually know what we were doing, and look, I know intended parents do as well, because they've had to work so long, and do they feel like the real parents, even though they really are. So, I think they also need that support. So I think that's what's missing.
So we need to wrap up this session, unfortunately, but I want to ask each of the panellists to think about one thing that if you could change one thing about the surrogacy system in Australia, what it would be, and I'll go through and I'll ask each one of you in a minute, but I also want to put in a bit of a plug in terms of talking about surrogacy, that there was mention earlier about in the media that we're seeing a lot of the sensational things when things go wrong. I'm also really keen to tell the good stories and to represent what is actually going on with surrogacy in Australia. So if anyone does want to get in touch, either through Sam or me at ABC, to talk about what's happened and how it's gone and the good side of the surrogacy issue. So please feel free to get in touch. So let's start with Peter. If there's one thing that you would like to see changed or improved?
A steady evolution in the culture, so that the sort of experiences we heard about from America become more commonplace here.
Chelsea?
I agree with Peter. Everybody has a right to be a parent, and we need to make it more accessible in the right way.
Jenny?
I think that introducing professional intermediaries and advertising into the Australian system, I think we've had a horror of everything commercial, and so when we banned commercial surrogacy, we also banned anyone else being involved in brokering and making an arrangement work. And I actually think there are good arguments that having repeat players who are professionals, who know what they're doing and who match parents and surrogates, for example, if they are practicing ethically and in a regulated system, I think that would be helpful. We shouldn't have everybody just having to find each other on Facebook. It's hard enough to get a date, honestly.
Renee?
I think the other guys have touched on it, quite well. But I just want to digress just slightly back to the last point and to say that from a surrogate's perspective, once you're pregnant with somebody else's baby, it is different. It is different in every capacity. So having access to counselling throughout pregnancy is really, really important. You can go through every single scenario in the book, but once it happens and it's reality, then who knows what's going to happen, and everything can change on a dime when you're throwing in hormones and intended parents who've had tragedy or awful experiences. But we're working in the current framework at the moment. So my suggestion to intended parents and to surrogates is you don't have to start talking about these things once you get into counselling. Talk about them now. Talk about them prior to everything else. We sat down on a table one night at dinner. We had an envelope in front of us with questions, and they weren't, tell me about yourself questions. They were, what are your thoughts on termination? What are your thoughts on disability? What happens if the surrogate dies? What happens if there's a life and death situation and there is a choice needed to be made between a surrogate and the baby she's carrying? They are confronting, they are emotional, but don't wait until counselling to talk about them. Don't wait until counselling to find out that you might be on a different page and you may not have the agreement that you thought about. So really think about it. Don't be afraid of those questions. Don't be afraid to have differing opinions and have debates, but make sure if you do have differing opinions that you get to a stage where you're on the same page. We've seen surrogates having to terminate pregnancies because of issues, and it's heartbreaking and it's an awful situation, but it can be countered in a positive way by the fact that that has been spoken through first and that there is support and counselling available. So I think that's really important.
Okay, thank you, Renee.
I'd like to reiterate that, and you can use your VATA brochure to cut it up and put it in the middle. Also, there should be no surprises in counselling. The ANZICA surrogacy counselling guidelines are on our website, so you can both look at that and you'll be thoroughly prepared. There'll be no question that comes out of a surprise. The thing I'd like to change is I think it's really sad to see people having to go overseas for surrogacy. I think it's so much nicer for the child where the surrogate is Australian, of a similar cultural background, is not too far away and much, more easy to connect with and much nicer for the parents as well. And also I think it must be really so challenging to go to a different country where you perhaps don't speak the language, you can't communicate easily with your surrogate, and you know, it's so much more difficult to have a lasting relationship with her, and if your donor is anonymous. I run a group for donor-conceived adults, and I can tell you that is a major issue for them if they can never find out who their donor is. So I would like to see a culture of ethical surrogacy in Australia, so people don't need to go elsewhere, and that it's affordable.
Okay, look, thank you so. Yeah, thank you so much, and I would especially like to thank Chelsea and Renee for giving us their personal experience, because I think that just brings it back to home, and that's what it's all about. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference today.